Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the 4 o'clock news and politics hour. Molly O'Brien at 3 o'clock had a great lineup. As always though, on Tuesdays, I'm very excited to welcome in Jennifer Lawless down at American University to talk about the latest in Beltway politics. Jennifer, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
We are doing just fine up here, back in the swing of things, back from school vacation. A lot going on down in D.C. right now. Let's talk about the aftermath of Florida, which we can continue to see played out both in the press and at a policy level. You know, is it just the news cycle that we're in, the continuation of sort of the Monday morning quarterbacking of the response? There's no doubt of the gravity and seriousness of the situation and the lives lost. Are we going to continue to look and see what that law enforcement response was, or will this have a natural progression that it ultimately will stop at some point?
Well, I think the reason we're focused so much on the response right now is because it's politically motivated. Ardently opposed to gun control, who feel like they have a stronger argument if they can demonstrate that the laws that were already on the books and the protocols that were already meant to be followed had been broken. Until we see sort of, I think, some kind of subsiding in terms of the energy and the anger regarding what happened, we're going to continue to see that kind of response because it's the way that the two sides are arguing about this. In fact, we saw this at CPAC last week. We've seen it with the NRA. They're very ardently opposed to the manner in which Florida state officials and the FBI handled these tips that they received, and the Democrats and people that are in favor of gun control are making the case that it doesn't matter. I mean, obviously that's something that needs to get fixed, but despite those tips, if this kid didn't have the gun that he had, we wouldn't have had the fallout. So I think it's just the latest way that we're talking about this gun control debate.
And as we know, and as we saw the reaction, it sounded like there were a number of law enforcement officials fully prepared and trained for this type of situation, but when something actually happened, it fell short. Is there any way that, I mean, again, how can you address it? We thought that all of these officials were perfectly trained, but is that going to be an approach now moving forward, how response teams and responses happen in these, as we see continued incidents?
Well, I mean, sure, we're going to talk a little bit about that. But what we've seen from experts and pundits and people involved over the course of the last week and a half is that all of these school shootings are a little bit different. And in some ways, the school in Florida was as prepared as you could possibly be. Now, yeah, there's no question that there were some people that clearly got cold feet and didn't do what they were supposed to do when, the rubber hit the road. But the reality is that the training and the programming that was seen as sort of, blue chip was in place in this school district. So it's difficult. One of the things that I do think is interesting, a lot of the students who have been coming out and talking about this in the aftermath have talked about the need for bulletproof glass and how it's really expensive, but that's one thing that schools across the country could implement and adopt to make these kinds of situations at least a little bit rarer.
Can we possibly see that approach being taken? Just the other week, we had Representative Greg Amore in here from East Providence. He put forth a couple of school safety measures, one of which was the school reimbursement for protective measures. And of course, states have finite budgets, but he mentioned the possibility, again, the feds aren't immune to fiscal and budgetary pressures. Could we see some sort of homeland security monies being available from a federal level, again, especially to cash-strapped states?
Technically, sure. In terms of the practicality of that kind of proposal, I think it would be rare, largely because the federal government has demonstrated no real interest in intervening in an issue like this. I mean, it's unclear. Would the NRA think that bulletproof glass goes too far? And if so, does that mean that Republicans would in no way, shape, or form ultimately support that? Now, I can't think of a reason off the top of my head why the NRA would oppose it, but on a daily basis, they demonstrate opposition to things that no normal person would think anyone would oppose. And so, it's a little bit tricky. Now, there are opportunities, though, for philanthropists and for other gun control organizations to provide those kinds of monies. The issue, of course, is that getting rid of guns, or at least limiting people's access to guns and improving background checks, would likely prevent the need for the bulletproof glass in the first place.
And we've seen a number of statements from the president in recent days from making sure that anyone under the age of 21 can't buy a firearm. Now, he's since, and it's been pointed out, backtracked from that a little bit, at least hasn't mentioned it in passing. Do you think he has, or is this just how Trump operates from kind of one proposal to another?
Well, I think that Donald Trump initially says what he actually believes, and then his people tell him that that's inconsistent with what the Republican Party believes and what the NRA believes. This is not the first time that we've seen this. You might recall on the campaign trail, Donald Trump was the only Republican in the primary who said that Planned Parenthood does good things. It quickly became clear that he was not allowed to say that Planned Parenthood does good things separate and apart from abortions, and he never said that again. We've seen the same thing with immigration. Bring me a DACA bill, I'll sign it. I want to save the Dreamers. And he backtracks on that. So issue after issue, I think his initial instinct is probably what he actually feels. And he probably does genuinely believe that an 18-year-old shouldn't have a gun. That said, he's sort of in the minority when it comes to gun rights advocates, and those are the people that he's ultimately kowtowing to.
And let's talk a little bit too. One of his proposals that we've not seen much from in recent days was this arming of teachers. It was very much in the forefront. Do you think that this was a realization that this can't be mandated from a federal level, that this would be something at the states level, that, tosses something out there and we see the political difficulties of making such statements?
Well, I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is I've yet to hear one teacher who said that was a good idea, right? So it didn't matter what network you were watching, what newspaper you were reading, to whom you were speaking. It was very clear that teachers didn't want that responsibility. And then there were also a whole slew of criminal justice issues that come forward. I mean, can you imagine in an inner city school, an African-American kid going into his pocket to pull out a cell phone and getting shot by the math teacher, right? I mean, it just opens a can of worms that is so beyond what any person would want in an educational setting that I just think it had no legs, and he realized that pretty quickly. The other thing was, he was quick to say that the only teachers who should be armed are those who are capable of being armed. Well, again, it's unclear how you determine that. Are you now doing teacher testing and shooting range practice? The whole thing is just kind of beyond the pale when it comes to legitimate and feasible school reforms.
And as we've often seen from this administration and the president himself, he is savvy with the media oftentimes. I mean, do you think, as you said, oftentimes his first reaction or his first statements tend to be what you think he possibly believes, but in that instance, is that sort of a bone to the NRA to say, hey, I support everyone's right to bear arms?
Yeah, I mean, look, the way that the Second Amendment has been framed by the various sides, I think highlights the difficulty of this, right? We know that Donald Trump's sons are hunters, that they take it very seriously. And I think that they believe that that means that they have to unequivocally support the Second Amendment. Most people would now argue, though, that the Second Amendment was not written at a time where we were talking about assault weapons and anybody getting a hold of them. It was meant to allow new U.S., the colonists and then ultimately citizens to protect themselves against outside invaders. And so, the way in which we pollute the Second Amendment is an issue. And so I think he probably believes that people should be able to have access to guns, but also that 21 is a viable age for that.
What do we see, if anything, as outcomes following all this talk, all this discussion, all this debate since Florida?
Well, we've seen nothing. We've seen one Republican House member say that we've gone too far and that the weapon that he used when he was in Iraq is not something that people should be able to bring into school. We have Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, who's running for the Senate, obviously, saying that we need some more regulation. And we have the president at least suggesting that an age limit should be modified. But beyond that, we've got nothing. Now, the one thing that's a little bit different is we do know that March 24th, there will be this national march in Washington and satellite cities across the country. If that has the kind of power that the Women's March did following the election, then maybe that's going to spur some kind of change at both the state and the federal level. But right now, it just looks like more of the same business as usual, unfortunately.
What do you have to say to the states? And we just were at a press conference here yesterday with the governor putting forth an executive order for this red flag legislation that would need to be actually taken up by the Assembly. The governor really doesn't have the authority to enforce this. But is this going to be an approach moving forward that we're going to see more enforcement sort of from that level of basically alerting authorities? And do you think there'll be difficulties in implementing this? Again, removal of arms from people who seem like they could harm themselves or others.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the infrastructure already exists and a lot of the rules are in place. It's just that there's no centralized way to collect these data and then to share them, even within a state over time, let alone across state lines. And so unless there's a real push, not only by the federal government, but also whether it be by the Association of Governors or the National Conference of State Legislators to come together and figure out some nationwide solution for information sharing, then no matter what rules and regulations we pass pertaining to background checks or mental health or anything else are not nearly as strong as they obviously need to be.
So let's tack from, again, the post-Florida aftermath, Jennifer, to other things taking place inside the Beltway right now. As we know, Communications Director Hope Hicks was at House Intelligence today on their Russia probe. Reports say that she didn't say much.
Apparently she said nothing. The question is whether the committee is going to hold her in contempt the way they did Steve Bannon. Now, she's in a very unique position because not only has she been a Trump aide for a long time, not only was she key during the transition and during the campaign, but she was also on the plane when Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. apparently came up with what that Russia meeting was really about. And so it's shedding light on those kinds of conversations and the meeting at Trump Tower that she's in a position to discuss. If she doesn't do that, then I can imagine that that's going to present a problem. Now, she has already spoken to Robert Mueller and she has spoken to the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I don't know relative to the importance of those committees whether the House is going to say it's worth it to hold her in contempt. But everybody walking out today was pretty displeased.
So, you know, as you mentioned, Bannon being held in contempt, I mean, clearly she's armed with legal counsel that says, don't say anything. But are there really any repercussions for her not?
Well, the only person that really can enforce any kind of consequences is the special counsel. And she's spoken to him. Now, we don't know what she's told the Mueller investigation, but we haven't heard that they've had a problem with her or that they've had to coerce any kind of testimony out of her. The issue becomes when her own interests no longer align with the interests of the White House lawyers. At this point, you know, the lawyers that she's armed with are interested foremost in protecting Donald Trump, the transition, and the campaign, not Hope Hicks. At some point, when those interests diverge, we've seen witnesses be far more willing to speak. So, you know, it's still early in that part of the process, but today certainly didn't suggest that she's ready to cooperate yet.
And so let's talk about another woman who was in the White House that you have opined on this week. Monica Lewinsky has again in the press come forth. She's been very vocal in recent years since her experiences down there, but since she was approached, I believe, by the founder of the Me Too movement and sort of re-interjected herself into the conversation, sort of taking the step back from what she said was the consensual affair with the president and saying maybe it was a power issue, and you had some comments in the Washington Times.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing with Monica Lewinsky is consistent with what we're seeing with women across the board in rethinking a lot of relationships that they are now interpreting through the lens of the Me Too movement. And, you know, Monica Lewinsky is not claiming now that Bill Clinton sexually harassed her or that the sex was not consensual, but she is beginning to think, wait a minute, is the president of the United States having an affair with a 24-year-old intern an actual symmetric power dynamic? And it's beginning to strike her that no, maybe not. And, you know, I think that the Me Too movement has generated that kind of thought process in a lot of people who, because there was no sexual harassment in terms of the way that we define it by the book, there was no rape or assault the way that we define it by the book, we've generally been raised, I mean, and she's the same age as I am, so, you know, women in their early 40s have been raised to think that, well, no, sexual harassment's a real thing, but that's not what President Clinton did. But Me Too, I think, has made all of us think a little bit more about the asymmetric power dynamics and the way that the experiences that we had when we were in our 20s might not actually have been the way that we recounted them. And I think that she's beginning to come to terms with the fact that he wasn't so great in what he did. And it was not a love affair. And it was not a situation where two consenting adults were coming at it from, two equal positions. It's not to say that she wasn't a consenting adult, but she certainly didn't have the upper hand or even a level playing field in that relationship.
Do you think she'll ever come around on Linda Tripp, speaking of someone from that era who's been very vocal in recent months about that as well? Of course, as we all know, Linda Tripp probably had her own motivations for doing what she did, but she's been claiming that she felt protective of Monica. And what we have seen from Miss Lewinsky is that I don't believe she has forgiven Miss Tripp for outing her, but it seemed that Linda Tripp was going down that road again, as they're both kind of revisiting history through a new lens.
Well, I don't forgive Linda Tripp either, I've got to say. I mean, at the time, I empathized with Monica Lewinsky probably more than most people did. And over the course of the last 20 years, I've remained obsessed with her. And so, I can't forgive Linda Tripp, so I don't know how Monica Lewinsky ever will. I do think, though, that what we're beginning to see is a reinterpretation of what happened in 1998 through the lens of where we are today, and it highlights sort of how far we've evolved as a society. If we heard today that an intern who was one of the only people able to work because there was a government shutdown propositioned the president, and the president took her up on it, I think we'd be appalled, right? We wouldn't be saying, well, that's just, a marital infidelity and an affair. And, keep in mind that the reason that this became a big deal in 1998 was not because of that relationship, but because Bill Clinton lied under oath in another sexual harassment case about that relationship. Mm-hmm. I think that, 20 years later, that relationship in and of itself would have raised enough eyebrows to make people question whether that was appropriate judgment on the part of a commander-in-chief.
Lots to talk about, as always, every Tuesday. But moving forward, what are we keeping an eye on inside the Beltway, Jennifer?
Well, the news just came out that Jared Kushner lost his top-level security clearance, along with some of the other top people in the White House. So he's now been downgraded to just secret, which means that General Kelly won this round. And the fallout from the Porter situation and those and the issues that arose in the last couple of weeks seem now to be applying even to the president's family, which I think suggests that Kelly realized that he had a job to do, and on multiple dimensions, he wasn't doing it. He's trying to pick up the pieces.
Do we know the rationale for the revocation of the security clearance?
Apparently, it's that anybody that is still with interim status loses the top security clearance. Okay. And, so Porter never would have gotten it. And now Kushner, because of all of these questionable relationships with foreign entities, is not going to be cleared either.
Well, it's not as though that he had done something in the wrong. It's just they're actually now playing by the rules.
They're playing by the rules, and people who are being investigated or people who have relationships that suggest they do not merit top security clearance are now not going to be given the access to the documents that they had been for the last year.
Well, interesting development today. As always, great talking with you down there, Jennifer. And we look forward to talking with you next Tuesday here in the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center.
Talk to you then.
Okay,
Bye.
Thanks, Jennifer. Bye-bye. Jennifer Lawless, down at American University, Skypes in every Tuesday to give us the inside take on DC politics. Appreciate her time. We'll be right back with our next guest here in the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. I'd like to welcome my next guest in, Sally Lapidi, CEO and President of Residential Properties. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
I appreciate your coming in to give us the skinny on 2018 on the market here in Rhode Island, but you had a banner year in 17.
We had an amazing year, and it was despite a lack of inventory. It was despite a crazy number of buyers coming in, but it was a banner year, and it actually matched the year before, which had more inventory and more and less activity. So we were thrilled. We were thrilled.
So talk with us. I mean, it's so hot right now. Is there any comparison to pre-07, 08, or is that apples and oranges?
Well, the inventory was much higher in 07 and 208, and so it's a little hard to compare that. I think what is the same is that we have very few houses on the market. I mean, it's under 3,000 houses in the single-family category. So that's as low as we've ever seen it in the state of Rhode
What's it
Island.
usually typically to the average layperson? I mean, someone who's buying
Well,
certainly knows.
I think right. I think that if the market has 5,000 houses, it makes a more balanced market for the buyer and the seller to negotiate. So when you're talking about under 3,000, there is competition for almost every price point.
So are we near the peak? I mean, are we going to continue to see?
Every time people ask me that, I say, if
I had $1 for every time someone asks me that.
I don't have a crystal ball. I have no idea if we're in the peak. What I can say is that the market is not appreciating as fast as it was pre-2007.
Okay.
So we saw, a 7% appreciation last year. The last quarter of the year, we saw a 13% appreciation. So let's look and see what happens in 2018, and then I'll be able to better tell you what I think.
Are we going to continue to see these prices just keep going up? East Side, other desirable locations, Boston.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's actually everywhere. It's all over the state of Rhode Island. Of course, the closer you are to the city, because more people work here and it's very walkable and it's beautiful and the food is great here, more people want to live in Providence. But the truth is, we're having multiple bids in every city and town.
Okay.
So it's everywhere.
So no concerns, potential for negative impact on economic growth. I mean, looking at this, I'm sure people ask you. We've talked with you about this too.
Yeah.
We looked at the potential if Amazon HQ2 gets up in Boston and we see this overflow of people who have, high salary ranges able to support this. I mean,
Yes.
What's your thoughts on that?
It's good for our economy. It's great for our economy. We would, and I've said this for years, if we had a better high-speed rail system going to Boston, we'd be a suburb of Boston. But at this point, it's the two briefcase family that chooses to live here. One works in Boston, one works in Providence, and they choose Providence. But economically, it's good for our entire state. It means new carpet goes in, houses get redone, people buy refrigerators. Every aspect of home ownership provides an opportunity in Rhode Island.
So we've heard talks about people literally coming into the airport, getting Uber rides, coming around, looking at houses. I mean, could you have predicted this continued growth of the market, even with the small inventory?
Well, I think that what Rhode Island has going for it is the ocean. It's well governed. It is beautiful. We've got the colleges. We've got great hospitals. So there are people that are moving out of large cities who are thrilled to go to a medium-sized city with very little traffic.
So are there challenges with limited inventory?
Yes.
We had a little discussion about that, so tell me what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so it's really hard for the buyer. It's much less hard for the seller. However, there are very few options for a seller to go to. So we have, thank goodness we're doing a project called Kettle Point. We're representing it. And they are wonderful condominiums on the water. It finally gives an answer to people who want to downsize, which means either a smaller house or a lower price.
And where's the Kettle Point? development?
Kettle Point is on the water in East Providence.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
What's heating up outside Providence?
So that's what's heating up outside Providence. So for home ownership, it is, you know, places like Kettle Point, and there are other new developments that are going up around the state. However, we just don't have enough. We don't have enough opportunities in almost every category. So it makes it very hard for the buyer. They fall in love with something on the internet. They can't wait to come into Providence. They end up being one of 5 people bidding on a house. It goes $30,000 more than the asking price, and one person's happy and 5 people are unhappy. So, you know, you can't make them all happy.
So other markets as well, you know, East Providence, its proximity
Yes.
to Providence.
Yep.
You know, places, let's go East Bay for instance, you
Yes.
know, could a Warren turn around? Everyone, there's a lot of restaurant, bar scene there.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we all know the Barrington's got the real estate, but what are the other potential areas that we could?
So Warren actually is a place that would be interesting to develop, to further develop. It has, the American Tourister building just has been made into apartments, and in most of these large mill buildings, developers frankly decide that they're going to do apartments because they can't afford to do it otherwise. So, but there are opportunities all over the state that are mill building conversions and new construction, and I think that we're seeing opportunities for people not in the lowest price ranges. So it is forcing people out of community that have been gentrified. It's a problem.
I was going to say, I mean, we
Yeah.
talk about the exploding prices on the east side and
Yes.
other places as
Yes.
well. I mean, what are you seeing with first-time home buyers? Is it just incredibly difficult at this point?
It is so hard for them. You know, our price points are high for new people into the market. They have debt from college. They have, you know, car loans. They're in their first jobs. But they're starting with 2-family houses.
Mm-hmm.
They're starting with 3-family houses, little condominiums. They're getting their foot in the door so that they can start to build some equity.
And so when you have conversations with city elected officials, state elected officials,
Yep.
when we talk from just even a policy standpoint, what are you talking about with them?
Well, what are we talking about?
How much time do we have?
All right. So, you know, our tax base in Providence is very high because probably 50% of our buildings are non-taxable. That puts a huge burden on, particularly on the east side. But it is hard for everyone, this tax burden. So I certainly talk a lot about that. You know, we talk about what companies are coming in, what opportunities can we create, what are we going to do with the Superman building, what are we going to do with, you know, we have so many opportunities. The I-195 land, how is that going to impact housing? And what kind of housing do we have to provide in the future? So those are the kinds of conversations I have with leadership.
So let's talk residential,
Yeah.
and let's talk about what really differentiates you from the rest.
Well, I think it's the quality of our agents. I think that I have very high standards. I hire only full-time people. They have to be nice. They have to want to work full-time. They're really smart. But our marketing is actually completely different from most people. We have a full-time video department, and we do videos for real video, not pictures set to music, which I think a lot of companies do, but we do real video telling a story about why somebody would want to move to this neighborhood, to this house. We have sold houses to people who looked at the video in California and flew out here and bought it and said, oh, I like your voice on the video, I like your voice seeing this house. So yeah, it's been great.
How much has video changed it for the people to really look and see, you know, and have the ability from their living rooms to sort of winnow down, even though it's a small inventory?
You know what? People from out of town depend on it.
Yeah.
You know, they love beautiful photographs, but that is not the tour of the house. As we toured as though you're walking through it with the agent, and I do all the voiceovers. So I tell them what is special about the house, what is special about the neighborhood, and it's been incredibly effective marketing for us. And I think it's really helped out-of-town buyers, particularly.
From a broad-based perspective,
Yeah.
industry-wide, if
Yep.
we've got people watching here, what would your advice be to sellers?
Well, besides higher residential properties, no. My advice to sellers is that your house is a commodity, and it is no different from anything else that is for sale. If you take a look at Architectural Digest and you look at how sparse the furnishings are in any one of those photographs, we believe in and have a full-time stager, and we send them into every one of our listings because photographs are a photograph of a home is no different from a website to find a perfect partner. You know,
You've got to make it look as great as possible.
Good as you can. Absolutely. And you know what? If the picture is bad of the person on Match.com, you're skipping to the next person.
You're swiping right.
Yeah, that's right. It's the same thing with a house. So you have to stage your house, have the best marketing that you can have on your house, and you've got to have an incredibly skilled broker who knows how to negotiate multiple offers.
On the flip side, advice to buyers.
Advice to buyers. All right, advice to buyers. Don't get emotionally involved in any house you look at. There will always be another one. Get yourself pre-qualified. Make sure that you have all your ducks in order so that when you make that offer, it's almost like a cash buyer because you have been qualified, you have your letter with you. Make sure you're represented by a broker who can give you all the information you need on what kind of an offer to make, and just hope that you got in there early enough so that you got to get your offer presented before 20 other people came in.
So how, driving around, you see the open houses, you
Yes.
see 20 cars, there are people probably with cash on hand, like literally.
There are.
Literally got the checkbook and said, I can pay for this.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
When it comes to that hyper competitiveness, and you talk to putting your ducks in a row,
Yes,
but
yes.
still, how do you, as you said, don't get emotionally attached.
Right, right.
You're like, I
That's right.
love this house, I need
That's
this
right.
house.
That's right. I think that you have to make sure that if you are really confident that you will get a mortgage, you can drop your mortgage contingency. If you take your, if you have a contractor come through with you, you've seen the pictures, you know that it needs work, take that contractor through. Find out that it's going to cost you $50,000 to renovate it. Make your offer based on that. But you have to make it as clean and as attractive an offer as you possibly can, or you're never going to get the house.
And here we are, beginning of 18, still a hot market. You know, what if you see that house and you're like, oh, with just a little more work, I could really end up making a good profit off that. Is it just, again, you really have to like the house?
You have to want to. I mean, I think most of us have lived in houses long enough that you respond to something sort of viscerally when you walk in. I knew the house that I bought, that the moment I walked in that front door, I said, oh, I could live here. I think that people do that all the time. It's very hard when you're in a competitive situation. Not all houses are competitively have competitive activity, but most are these days, and particularly in the price range between $250 and $600.
Okay.
That is it's just as competitive as it can be. Yeah.
So what are you thinking 18 is going to look like? You've had 3 banner years in a row of leading the state here.
Yes, we have.
After 17, do you expect to improve even on 17?
Well, I'm very kind, but I'm horribly competitive, and so I set standards for myself, which means I want to sell $1 billion worth of real estate. And we are just under 800 million this year, which is frankly over 300 million more than our next competitor. I mean, we sell a lot more real estate. And the truth is, I want to get to $1 billion, and I'm going to get there.
$1 billion. Well, we could very well have Sally Lapides here at this time next year, but I appreciate your coming in to give folks a little overview of the market as, again, we know inventory is tight, but wanted to get some nuances, from residential properties. Sally, I appreciate you taking the time. We'll talk soon. Okay, take care. I'll let you around the corner.
Thanks.
Sally Lapides, CEO and President of Residential Properties, just had another state-leading year. Just talked about wanting to do $1 billion in 18, talking about the tight market, emerging hotspots in Rhode Island, advice for buyers and sellers. I appreciate Sally taking the time to come in. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with our next guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. I'd like to welcome a familiar face. He's been here before, the former head of the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats of America, now newly declared candidate for Rhode Island Senate District 5. Sam Bell, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you so much for inviting me in.
Well, it's the big official kickoff day.
Yes, it is.
The campaign is launched. We are in full election season right now.
Indeed.
How long have you been mulling over this run for?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say a couple of months. Yeah, you know, I've thought about the possibility of running for office for a little while. You know, I've been for a long time, when I first got involved in politics here, I was upset about the Tea Party. I was concerned about what was happening to our country, the national level. And then I came and I found out what was happening here in Rhode Island, and I was really horrified. And, you know, my mother raised me to be a Democrat. I had basic, an understanding that we should have a Democratic Party that fights for everyone, that fights for fundamental, basic democratic values. And what I saw here in Rhode Island was a party where most of the Democrats in the state Senate, including the incumbent in this race, are endorsed by Right to Life, where the top Democrats in the House and the Senate were taking thousands of dollars of money from the NRA, where when we cut taxes for the rich, we cut the top income tax rate by so much. The only state in the country that's cut it by more is North Dakota.
So we've talked before about the differentiation between the Democrats here in the state. And one of the stories actually GoLocal had written was Governor Raimondo taking money from the top NRA lobbyist, William Murphy. How big is the rift between, as you call them, the conservative Democratic element and where you see the progressive Democrats going?
I mean, I think that there are fundamental differences. And what I think is really exciting, people always tell us that, we've taken on some difficult fights here in Rhode Island. I remember when we first started fighting for gun control. After Newtown, I was absolutely heartbroken. It was so devastating to watch 20 children mowed down, and to know that we could be passing policies that would do something about that and make that never happen.
Tell viewers, really what that you had been pushing for at that time.
At that moment, I remember there was a gun control movement that I was very happy to be part of that came together right after Newtown. And what we did was we put together, there were a whole bunch of proposals, and they all went down. There was at that point people were talking about assault weapons ban, which was the right policy because it would have stopped it. And the reason everything went down, I remember the first time I thought about taking on this fight, I remember standing in the parking lot of Atlantic Mills after an ONA meeting, and a friend of mine who'd been an activist for a while, I asked her, why can we never take on gun control in the state? And she told me, it's because all the top leaders in the Democratic Party are taking money from the NRA. And so after that first legislative session after Newtown where we got nothing done, I tried to figure out where the money came from. And I started an investigation, and it turns out that it was all being illegally funneled in from the national NRA.
You had a huge role, yes, in this investigation.
Right, and ultimately we got their illegal funding stream shut down. We got them slapped with a $63,000 fine, which is second highest in state history. And since that happened, since the illegal money stream from the NRA stopped, we've finally been able to pass some incremental gun control legislation. I just came here from the launch of the assault weapons ban campaign, which I'm really excited about, and I think that we really finally are going to be able to pass real gun control in the state. But people have always told me it's a battle you can never win. And I've heard that time and time again. You know, I remember when we launched the Stop the Stadium Deal campaign, when they wanted to move McCoy Stadium to the downtown waterfront park on the I-195 land. People told us that there's no way that you can possibly win. But so many Rhode Islanders stood up and said no, and volunteered, collected signatures, knocked on doors, went to rallies, that we won.
Won round one. Now, what are your thoughts on round two with Apex?
I think that this new deal is not a good deal. I don't think it's quite as bad as the original deal, but I still think it's misguided. There are a lot of things that really we should work out that are just not worked out in the current deal. So for instance, I'm very concerned. I think the lesson that we should have learned from McCoy is when you don't fix the roof, it does rain in the state of Rhode Island, and if you don't fix the roof, you will get massive water damage. And you cannot sign a stadium deal that does not have enough money in there for maintenance to replace the roof. And this current deal has $4.5 million over 30 years without any adjustment for inflation. That's not even enough to basically replace the roof. Under this current deal, exactly what happened at McCoy is going to happen again. We're not going to be able to replace the roof. It will leak, and there will be massive water damage. And we need to be able to get these basics right. I also think from just the amount of money they're asking for is unprecedented compared to the most recent deal in a comparable league, the Charlotte Knights deal. It's outrageous how much more money they're asking for. But I think that ultimately this is probably going to go down because we created a movement in the state where people will stand up and say no to corporate welfare. But I think that the fight that we really need to take on is the fight to resist the Trump agenda. I remember after that election, I was more beaten down than I've ever been. I've seen a lot of things in politics, but nothing hit me like that. That night was the only night I ever smoked a cigarette in my life. Drank more than I really should have. Drank more than I have since, to be honest. And I go to work for months after, just stare at the screen, and it was bad. But I realized that we needed to take on the fight to resist the Trump agenda here in Rhode Island.
And the event last weekend up at the State House, there was the no president is above the law. What do you have to say to folks who shoot back maybe from the other side and say, the economy's fine, what's your issue?
I think if you look at what Trump tried to do, the first part of his agenda that he really tried to push hard was slashing Medicaid by repealing Obamacare. And Democrats stood up, and we protested, we said no, we resisted, and we defeated his Medicaid cuts. And so because of that, we did not see the economic pain that they would have brought to this country. But here in Rhode Island, we have, in budget after budget, slashed Medicaid. We saw Memorial Hospital close, provider after provider has closed down, and the healthcare system that serves our neediest Rhode Islanders is in a real crisis. And we have to stand up, and I believe that we can take on the fight just like we did at the national level. We defeated the Medicaid cuts at the national level, and we can defeat this core element of the Trump agenda right here in Rhode Island. The second part of the Trump agenda that he really pushed hard was tax cuts for the rich. And I believe we can take that fight on here. Rhode Island has cut taxes for the rich more than any state except for North Dakota. And I believe that, yes, we can take on the fight to repeal the tax cuts for the rich. Ever since the biggest tax cut for the rich in 2006, we have faced budget crisis after budget crisis. And we need the space to be able to say, enough is enough, let's repeal the tax cuts for the rich so we can talk about where to invest, not where to cut.
So that was going to be my question. When you talk about trying to maintain adequate Medicaid services, there's a price tag, and your answer to that is revisit the tax cuts.
I also think that, and we never talk about this, but in Rhode Island, Medicaid is privatized. That's not normal. I think that we should convert Medicaid to a true single-payer system. We do not need to waste the amount of money that we spend on privatizing the system. And so there is real waste in Medicaid in Rhode Island, and it's the money that we pay to private insurance companies to administer it, instead of having a publicly run single-payer system. So I do believe that there is space to restructure the Medicaid budget, but we should invest that money in care and repealing the Medicaid cuts. The final part of the Trump agenda, I think it's really important that we take on here in our state, has been a legacy of horrifying racism that Trump has brought to our country. And here in Rhode Island, there are things that we need to do. In our city, in Providence, we have a legacy of deeply segregationist housing policy. And it is time that we join the rest of other blue states in banning segregated luxury housing. You know, most cities and towns do not allow this, but here in Rhode Island, instead of subsidizing affordable housing, we subsidize the kind of segregated luxury housing that isn't legal in Boston. It isn't legal in New York.
What do you think of DARE's rent control campaign here in the city, trying to get that on the ballot for the city of Providence?
I think when you look at rent control, it can sometimes have a positive effect in the short run, but it doesn't really fully address the problem. The problem is in the overall market, and I really don't think rent control goes far enough in combating our affordable housing crisis. The problem is that we simply do not subsidize affordable housing. Instead, we only subsidize luxury housing. We spend less than 1/10 per capita what Massachusetts spends on affordable housing. We can change that. And, you know, I think it's really best to look at the overall market instead of just setting a couple price controls, which will help a little bit, but it doesn't take us nearly far enough. And so I don't think that it really goes far enough. But there are other things that we need to do to combat a legacy of racism in our state. And one of the things I strongly disagree with the incumbent on is mass incarceration. You know, he was the guy who sponsored the criminal gangs bill, which says slaps 10 years on your sentence if the cops decide without due process that you're part of a criminal gang. And you can be arrested for a year, have a sentence, and then go to jail for 11. And it is time that we combat a legacy of mass incarceration in our state. And I believe it is time to stand up and say, yes, we have to take on the prison industrial complex, we have to end the school to prison pipeline, and it's time to take on these fights in Rhode Island.
So speaking of battles, here we are 2018, there is a marijuana legalization study commission still currently underway. Did you think that Rhode Island would be at this point in 2018?
You know, I have often been cynical and I guess realistic is probably the word about the state of our politics right now. You know, the legislature doesn't share the same kind of basic democratic values that the legislatures in other blue states do. And so we are really at a risk of being an island of prohibition here. Marijuana is going to be regulated and taxed and legally bought in the state of Massachusetts, the state of Vermont. It looks like pretty soon in the state of Connecticut. And we really risk being an island of prohibition. And plenty of Rhode Islanders will drive 5 minutes, 10 if they're following the speed limits, to Massachusetts and buy weed, take it back illegally, and smoke plenty of weed. But what we're not going to be able to do is to regulate it properly, to take care of health outcomes. We're going to certainly lose all the jobs that would go to Rhode Island. And I think the biggest problem is we need to treat drugs as a public health issue. We do not need to approach drugs as by criminalizing them. And if we remain an island of prohibition, we're not going to have the ability to do what we need to about public health here in Rhode Island. I think that's a real travesty. I think it's time that the legislature act. But I am not optimistic about the prospects for this year unless we elect new people who are going to change how the legislature operates.
Island of Prohibition, let's talk about the governor's proposal for sports betting to fill the budget hole. What was your response to that in her budget proposal?
My concern here is twofold. On the one hand, I think that when we invest in gambling, we always have to worry about gambling that targets low-income communities. And here in Rhode Island, I was very proud to oppose the Tiverton Casino proposal because I don't think it's the right kind of gambling. I thought that it targeted, designed specifically to target problem gamblers and specifically to target low-income communities. Sports betting is not quite as problematic in that aspect, but it still has some problems when it comes to gambling addiction. And I don't think we want to look at this as a revenue source. We want to look at it as the right way to regulate it, and we don't want to try and squeeze as much money as possible. I'm also concerned about the constitutionality of this proposal. I think that it is unclear that it is legal without consulting the voters of the state of Rhode Island. And so it puts us at risk that if we balance the budget on the back of a proposal that might well get struck down in the courts, it's dangerous, because then we might find ourselves in a difficult situation where all of a sudden the budget is tens of millions of dollars out of whack. And so I think it is important that if the legislature proceeds with this proposal, they obtain an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court of Rhode Island to ensure that it is constitutional. And I really urge them to take that step, because if not, there is a real risk. And I think it is important that we figure out whether or not we do need to consult the people of Rhode Island. I would also say that as just a basic idea, it is probably worth asking the people of Rhode Island. There's no reason to err on the side of not consulting with the people.
So it's interesting. I don't know the legal precedent of, waiting to see at the federal level from SCOTUS how they rule on sports betting. Does that need to be decided before it's decided here? But then it's also contained in the budget, so it's almost as though we have to wait and see what happens federally. But then could we be past the point of no return? I don't know if they can do it concurrently.
Right. Well, the other thing I'm asking about is the state constitution.
Yes.
We have a provision in the state constitution that the people of Rhode Island have to be consulted when we expand gambling. And it is unclear to me. I think that with sports betting, the law is not clear. I'm not going to say it's unconstitutional. I'm not going to say it's constitutional. I think this is a case where the law is vague and unclear, and it is necessary that we find clarity before we move forward.
Oh, you're right. There's two channels. There's federal and the state as well.
And the other thing I'd say about this is, when Twin River was set up, some of the money from Twin River went to the Narragansett. And we set a precedent that if we weren't going to allow our Native American tribes to control gambling, we were going to give them some revenue to support all the important programs that they do. When the Tiverton Casino came forward, which was on Wampanoag land, none of the money went to the newly reorganized Wampanoag community. And I think that was a problem, and I'm concerned that with this new sports betting proposal, none of the revenue is going to support our Native American community here in Rhode Island. And I think that we need to talk about, and it goes back to the legacy of systemic racism. The state has not treated Native American populations with any semblance of ethics. Even in recent years, there have been horrible, horrible things like the smokehouse raid. And I would go so far as to say the way that the state police handled the recent elections dispute. I think that it was not right for the state of Rhode Island to step into that elections dispute in the way that they did.
And remind viewers about
So
this.
there was a heavily disputed election for the Narragansett tribe. And there were allegations of a coup. And the state essentially backed the sitting leadership, which it had been alleged essentially had more or less stolen an election. So there were allegations, and it was a heavy dispute, and I think the state did not handle it in the most sensitive way. But I do think that it's crucial going forwards when we talk about gambling revenue that we remember that we need to invest in Native American communities, because we do not allow them to control gambling on their own, as many states do. The state essentially has a monopoly for private businesses that have nothing to do with the tribes. And we should spend some of the revenue on.
We'll see what happens with the gaming proposal moving forward. Finally, while I have you in here, Sam, one of the things that we've seen in recent months is we do know the candidate survey from the Progressive Democrats of America asking candidates if they would support current leadership, House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. Do you think that is the litmus test for someone who says I'm running as a progressive Democrat?
I think it's the litmus test. I have spoken out, and I think it's no secret that I I'm critical of the House Speaker. I believe that his values are very different from the Democratic party's. He said Rhode Island should be supportive of Trump, and I don't agree with that. I think that that progressives should take a strategy that combats his leadership when he does things that are incorrect. And I think that we should have the courage to stand up to powerful leaders like the Speaker. And I do believe sometimes, one of the things that happens in the State House is there's this culture where you're not supposed to vote your conscience. You're just supposed to vote along with the leadership. And one of the things I do appreciate about the Senate leadership is that they have not maintained the same culture. So in the Senate, and I think it's a really healthy thing, and I'm really pleased that the new Senate leadership is encouraging this more, I think it's great for people to vote their conscience. And I do believe that that extends to leadership votes.
Okay, very good. Well, I'm glad that I got you in here today on the official kickoff day. Sam Bell running for Rhode Island Senate District 5. Sam, I'm sure we'll hear more from you moving forward as election season is in full swing. So I appreciate you taking the time to come in today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'll let you go around the corner. We'll see you soon. Sam Bell, former head of the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats of America, announced today running for Rhode Island Senate seat in District 5. So I appreciate him taking the time to come in here to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. So that just about wraps up another day here in downtown Providence on GoLocal Live. Molly O'Brien was up at 3. Be sure to check out her show. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 o'clock with The Taste, all things food and drink here in Rhode Island. I'll be back at 4 with news and politics. Stay tuned for more news, politics, lifestyle, and sports on GoLocalProv.com. Catch us on Facebook, but we'll catch you back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center tomorrow. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.